Tonight, we step back into the Victorian era, a time when cleanliness was praised as a virtue but often looked very different beneath the surface. Behind polished appearances and heavy perfumes, daily hygiene was far less refined than the image suggests. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy exploring history's quieter, stranger corners with me. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? It's always fascinating to see who joins us across time zones. Now dim the lights, settle in, and let's uncover the curious truth about what it really meant to be clean in Victorian Britain. Victorians claimed that cleanliness was next to godliness, but the truth? Many wore perfume not to freshen up, but to cover up. Behind lace curtains and polished brass, sponge baths often stood in for real bathing and heavy odours hung in cramped homes. Respectability could mean smelling presentable, even if you hadn't seen a tub of hot water in weeks. The surprising part is how long society could keep up that illusion. And to understand why they clung to it so fiercely, we need to look at what clean meant to them in the first place. The phrase, cleanliness is next to godliness, carried enormous weight in Victorian culture. For many, being seen as clean meant being seen as upright, trustworthy, and respectable. It wasn't only about hygiene, it was a visible moral code, adopted in churches, schools, and homes. The idea suggested that neat appearances reflected discipline and inner virtue, while visible dirt hinted at weakness or corruption. It was less about soap and water and more about belonging on the right side of social judgment. Yet keeping up appearances was a challenge. Imagine living along a soot-darkened street in London or Manchester, where coal smoke filled the air and sewage often ran in open gutters. No matter how careful you were, grime crept in. Still, the expectation lingered. If you turned up in public looking dishevelled, you risked being marked as careless or morally suspect. Church and civic leaders often reinforced this pressure, warning that outward filth could signal inner disorder. This didn't mean that every family believed this wholeheartedly, but the association was strong enough that few dared ignore it. The difficulty was that real bathing required time, fuel, and facilities most families lacked. So, clean became less about frequent washing and more about careful presentation. A polished shoe or a stiff collar carried more meaning than whether you'd recently had a bath. Daily rituals of brushing clothes, scrubbing hands and nails, and starching shirt fronts were substitutes for full hygiene. A father could go weeks without submerging in hot water, but if his shirt looked fresh on Sunday, he passed as respectable. In this sense, cleanliness became a visual shorthand for discipline, not literal washing. This focus on appearances bristled with class tension. For wealthier households, keeping up the illusion was easier. Servants managed laundry, polished furniture, and kept wardrobes crisp. A mahogany washstand in the bedroom itself functioned as much as a status symbol as a practical piece. For poorer families, the standards were harsher. A maid might work long hours scrubbing floors, only to be criticised if her apron wasn't ironed by morning service. In practice, the same moral code applied across classes, but the poor had fewer resources to meet it and greater punishment for failing. That pressure shaped daily life in subtle but exhausting ways. Parents drilled children to appear washed and tidy for school because teachers and neighbours read neatness as a sign of discipline. Young workers blackened their boots, not just to look smart, but to prove they were dependable. Women spent hours over laundry so their husbands could walk into factories or offices in white collars, even if household chores left their own clothes neglected. These routines weren't frivolous. They could affect hiring, marriage prospects, or even a landlord's willingness to rent. The weight of this system lay in how much it asked people to pretend. Sermons professed the value of inner purity, yet daily reality tied morality to polished surfaces and neat seams. The illusion stretched from the household to the city itself. Streets might be foul, water tainted, and coal dust on every sill, but orderly clothes made it possible to overlook the chaos. By mid-century, reformers and the new Public Health Act of 1848 began nudging cleanliness toward more practical measures, but for most families, the old pressures of appearance clung tightly to everyday life. This way of thinking gave society a sense of structure, but it could also weigh heavily on individuals. People carried the unspoken knowledge that one muddy walk home, one stained cuff, or one day without starch could change how neighbours perceived them. Cleanliness became as much a marker of belonging to a respectable community as attending church or paying one's debts. And for those in cramped housing with little chance to live up to these standards, the association of dirt with moral failure became an excuse used against them, poverty framed as a stain on character. So, cleanliness is next to godliness wasn't only spiritual advice, it served as a visible dividing line between who counted as respectable and who did not. It reached into schools, into workplaces, and deep into family routines, turning polished shoes, starched collars, and tidy parlours into daily obligations. But looking clean and being clean were two very different things, and keeping up the illusion often mattered more than true hygiene. And that raises a question. When the shine of a collar or the polish of a boot didn't hide the body's smell, what did people do then? Imagine starting your day by reaching not for soap and water, but for a splash of perfume. For many Victorians, fragrance wasn't a luxury, it was a stand-in, something that could buy a little time before anyone noticed the reality. Colognes, powders, and scented oils weren't simply fashion accessories, they were practical tools for disguising odour when a full wash was out of reach. If your house lacked hot water, and getting it meant hauling coal, boiling kettles, and carrying heavy buckets from yard to tub, a quick dab of scented liquid was far easier. Victorian Britain was steeped in these makeshift solutions. Bay rum, lavender water, rose essence, bergamot, even simple vinegar. These weren't indulgences, they were everyday defences. People sprinkled powder under their arms before church, rubbed cologne onto wrists before work, or slid a small pouch of dried herbs into a pocket just to make it through crowded, sweaty streets. Instead of removing smells, they painted over them. To modern ears, that might sound counterproductive, but for them, it was respectable. The reliance on scent had very practical roots. Consistent bathing required an enormous effort most families couldn't afford to make. To fill a tub meant scavenging wood or coal for heat, waiting as water warmed, then carrying it bucket after bucket to fill even half a basin. In winter, that cost could be prohibitive. Coal was needed for cooking and survival, not long baths. So even those determined to stay fresh turned to fragrance as the lighter, cheaper solution. A few drops of lavender oil spared you an afternoon of hard labour. Where you stood in society determined what kind of masking you could practice. The wealthy reached for imported French perfumes or custom blends sold by London's apothecaries, rosewater in fine glass bottles, bergamot packed in little gilded vials. Middle-income households relied on simple lavender sachets or vinegar rinses for hair and skin. The poor, facing long hours in factories or markets, had only sharp, cheap scents, herbs stuffed into clothing, or a splash of vinegar water under the arms. Smell itself became a class marker, a kind of social shorthand that told neighbours who had money for imported rose oil and who grasped at whatever strong odour was affordable. Set this against the broader environment, and the reliance on fragrance begins to make sense. Victorian cities were drowning in stench. Horses left manure across cobbled streets, sewage lines overflowed into rivers and gutters, and coal smoke settled on carpets and curtains alike. A body's natural odour barely stood out against that backdrop, but in polite society, even a hint of sweat was judged harshly. Fragrance wasn't only for vanity, it was armour against the overwhelming mix of filth that was the everyday air of an industrial city. Inside homes, the layering of smells built up in odd ways. Coal smoke clung to fabrics, vinegar was spattered onto floors to cut through staleness, Herbs were pressed into drawers to freshen laundry while cologne or bay rum lingered on the skin. None of this created what we'd think of as true cleanliness. Instead, it organized the chaos. Each scent was part of a defense, ordered layers of aroma that signaled respectability despite the lack of soap and running water. To live in such a household was to know that clean meant less about scrubbing and more about control. Social expectations amplified the practice. At dinners or dances, nobody assumed their peers had bathed that morning. What mattered was that no obvious odor escaped. A faint cologne was polite. A stronger scent suggested real effort. For women, the right blend implied refinement, as though family resources extended far enough to invest in her appearance. For men, bay rum projected confidence and discipline, a kind of borrowed edge of sharpness. Scent was part of social currency, understood as effort toward respectability rather than laziness disguised. Smells carried moral weight. Victorians equated neatness and good odor with discipline and integrity. If you looked pressed and smelled acceptable, you were considered reliable. If you smelled of sweat, people judged you as careless or morally weak. By masking body odor, you weren't just avoiding discomfort. You were signaling adherence to a shared code. Perfume, in this sense, was treated less as a cosmetic than as a moral reinforcement of status. That said, masking worked only so far. Hot summer days broke through the perfumes quickly. Linen absorbed sweat, starch hardened into acrid residue, and shoes reeked after long walks. Perfume and powders gave maybe an hour or two of acceptable cover. Beyond that, odours always crept back. This gap reveals the truth of Victorian hygiene. Most weren't trying to be spotless. They aimed for just enough control of their appearance and scent to pass in public. Respectability set the bar lower than we might imagine today. Because scent was so tied to class, even fragrance itself carried the signature of hierarchy. Upper dash class notes leaned floral and foreign, presenting exclusivity. Middle class choices came from herbal mixes brewed at home, sending signals of thrift and propriety. The working poor smelled of vinegar or cheap penny soaps. To enter a room was to announce your status by the scent you carried, long before you greeted anyone. So Victorian reliance on colognes, oils and powders wasn't simply vanity, it was necessity. Small, scented defences against a world where genuine washing was often beyond reach. Smell became a performance of cleanliness that barely touched the body itself. What passed as clean was really the temporary invisibility of dirt and sweat. Yet for all their tricks, there came moments when fragrance could no longer keep society's illusions intact. Strong scents faded, and stronger problems loomed. Problems that oils and rosewater could never disguise. Perfume might smooth over daily life, but when it came to actual washing, the basin, the sponge, the cold water, Victorians faced a very different reality. How often did an upper-class Victorian actually sink into a tub of hot water? Far less often than you'd probably expect. The popular image of elegant women soaking daily in porcelain baths or gentlemen enjoying steamy tubs attended by servants, looks impressive in paintings and novels. But daily reality was far smaller and colder. In most homes, even wealthy ones, the standard routine centered around a ceramic jug and a wide basin on a washstand in the bedroom. Each morning a servant poured water into the bowl, and with that a person wiped down their face, hands, and maybe a little more with a sponge or cloth. That quick ritual served as the bath for the day. The water was usually cold, carried up from the kitchen or scullery. Unless someone bothered to heat a kettle, you had to brace yourself against a brisk splash before breakfast. And if you did want more, say enough water for a proper wash, it involved serious work. Kettles had to be heated over coal fires, buckets hauled carefully upstairs and poured in one after another. It wasn't just effort, it consumed time and coal, both precious. And for a household with several children, plus staff, the labour added up fast. This helps explain why many households set aside just one evening a week for what was politely called bath night. When bath night arrived, the setup wasn't as glamorous as you might picture. Families who could afford tubs owned heavy cast iron or tin vessels, often dragged into the kitchen where fires burned strongest. Pipes and running hot water were luxuries most houses didn't have until later in the century, so everything still depended on heated buckets. Often the whole family used the same water in sequence. Father went first, then mother, then the children in order of age, dipping into the same tub as the water got cooler and grimier. Privacy, warm water, and individual fresh baths were luxuries reserved for palaces and the very top households. That's why for day-to-day cleanliness, only the visible areas got attention. Your hands and face were essential. Dirty palms made a bad impression in handshakes, and a smudged face suggested a careless or slovenly character. Sponging under the arms sometimes made the list, especially in summer when heavy layers of clothing trapped sweat beneath. Beyond that, a brushed head of hair, a starched shirt collar, and a splash of perfume or powder carried most of the weight in passing as well kept. The whole body cleanses we think of as normal today just weren't part of the routine. Fuel costs and labour burdens discouraged frequent bathing. Fires already burned through coal or wood just to cook meals and heat rooms, so devoting extra fuel to hot water was considered wasteful. For working households where coal had to last week to week, the idea of keeping a bath constantly prepared was laughable. Even among families who employed servants, hauling and heating gallons of water every morning was considered a misuse of staff time. The sponge bath with its quick rinse and wipe down did the job, taking minutes rather than hours. Baths, when they happened, became something closer to an event. Diaries from the time sometimes note a "took the bath" entry with as much weight as attending a social gathering. It was memorable because it consumed time, required preparation, and often lined up alongside other chores like laundry day, when sheets and body could be refreshed together. Some people even described the rare experience as invigorating or pure because of how unusual it was. There was a sense of renewal attached to it precisely because it didn't happen every day. Furniture became part of this ritual. Decorative washstands with room for a pitcher and basin were status symbols, proudly displayed in bedrooms and guest chambers. Wealthy families might buy carved mahogany stands with marble tops, even if the water inside was only cold. The furniture itself functioned almost like proof of respectability, signalling that proper rituals of cleansing were observed, even if the cleansing was only partial. Here again, appearance mattered more than deep washing. Children usually fared no differently. Bedtime might include wiping soil from hands, rinsing the face, or soaking muddy feet. Pajamas went on over unwashed bodies until the next official bath day rolled around. And while modern medicine promotes frequent bathing as hygienic, doctors in the 19th century sometimes suggested the opposite. Period medical advice warned that too many plunges could open the pores and leave people vulnerable to drafts and illness. So for many parents, sponging down a child was not only simpler, but also consistent with what they thought best for their health. Morning routines followed this rhythm like clockwork. You would splash cool water on your face, scrub your hands with rough towels that tugged at the skin, run a stiff brush over your scalp until it tingled, and finish with a layer of powder or scent. That was enough to pass as clean by everyday standards. The same steps repeated each day, establishing the illusion of hygiene without fully washing the whole body. For most people, this was a lifelong practice. Long years of sponge baths punctuated occasionally by formal soaks. In fact, an ordinary Victorian man might live his entire life with only a handful of thorough, hot immersions. Even at the top of society, the habits looked surprisingly similar. Wealthy women might occasionally visit public bathhouses for novelty, but at home they used their pitchers and basins much like everyone else. The real differences showed in the linens, perfumes, and the time servants put into keeping clothing neat. The core act of wiping with a sponge and pouring away the basin water afterward was universal. The water smelled of soap flakes if you were lucky, but often it was just plain cold. Still, once poured down a drain or tossed from a window, the basin was refilled and set back in place for the next ritual. So in practice, what defined a respectable Victorian wasn't constant bathing but ritualized gestures of neatness. The basin and sponge created just enough freshness for public life, allowing people to step outside without suspicion. It was a balance of effort and illusion, an unspoken agreement that appearances mattered most. And if this was the standard for washing bodies, clothes demanded even stranger methods to maintain their spotless image. If the basin sufficed for bodies, clothes needed different tricks, some of them unexpected. What cheap, everyday substance did Victorians rely on for laundry? Human urine. It sounds shocking now, but in the 19th century it was practical thrift, not scandal. Clean water was hard to access in crowded cities, soap was expensive, and commercial detergents didn't exist. What everyone did have at hand were chamber pots and buckets. Left to sit, urine fermented and released ammonia, which worked as a strong cleaner. That sharp compound cut grease and dirt far better than cold water could on its own. So while wealthier homes might pay for soap flakes or send clothes to laundresses, poor families leaned on what was freely available in their own households. Imagine setting wash day in motion. A housewife or washerwoman faced piles of shirts and stockings after a week of smoky city air and hard labour. Water was hauled in tin buckets, rubbed through washboards, beaten against stones, and still stains held fast. Soap couldn't be wasted on every garment. That's when a bucket of stored chamber fluid became the secret weapon. Clothes were soaked in it, stirred down with poles, or even trampled by bare feet before rinsing. It wasn't glamorous, but it broke up sweat and grease, saving both money and effort. Everyone in poor neighbourhoods knew about it, even if few admitted it openly. The process started with saving urine over several days. Families poured it into barrels until it began to turn, the smell sharp and acrid. By laundry day, the liquid was strong with ammonia. Into this sloshing mix went heavy cotton, wool, and linens. The fabrics were soaked, stomped, wrung out, then rinsed in cold water. Poverty meant working with what you had, and here chemistry did most of the cleaning. Rinsing disguised the worst of the odour, and drying in open air lessened it further. To modern noses, the idea sounds unbearable, but to Victorians it was just one more routine chore. The contradiction is stark. A man could step out in a spotless white shirt, gleaming in the sunlight, projecting perfect respectability. Yet only a few days before, that shirt had soaked in a tub of chamber lye. The faint residue sometimes lingered. Catch a passing breeze and a nose close enough might detect it. Still, the visual impression mattered more than the faint smell. Looking clean counted, smelling odd was an annoyance, but forgivable. Professional laundresses used the same practices, scaled up. Many served wealthier households and kept barrels of fermented urine on hand. They soaked table linens, stiffened collars, and brightened dress shirts. The ammonia bleached fabrics and kept them crisp. Wealthy families preferred perfumed starches and imported soaps, but the foundation often remained the same. Even the gleaming collars fastened beneath a top hat could have been dipped in a barrel of urine before parading through the park. The irony was built into the system. Outward polish, achieved through methods few liked to discuss. The privileged avoided the smell by outsourcing the labour. Washerwomen toiled in riverside sheds or back kitchens where strong odours mixed with smoke and steam, forming a background stench that nobody questioned. For those washing indoors, the smell spread through the home. Buckets sat by fireplaces or out in narrow yards. Children grew up learning. That chamber lye was part of daily life, as ordinary as bread or coal. Waste wasn't thrown away immediately. It was stored and repurposed. Cleanliness meant reusing what you already had. This wasn't limited to the household. Trades relied on the same material. Leather tanners softened hides with it, and cloth workers known as fullers cleaned wool with it in bulk. Collecting human waste became a small informal trade, with middlemen carrying buckets from homes to workshops. In that way, laundry habits at home reflected a broader pattern in industry. What sounds foul today was simply resource management then, economy and necessity wrapped in one. The results leaned heavily toward visual success. Clothes laundered by this method came out looking far better than they smelled. White shirts held their brightness. Dresses looked neat. Collars stood crisp. The scent, though faint, rarely disappeared entirely. Victorians accepted this clash. They layered perfume over garments, packed lavender in drawers, sprinkled vinegar for freshness. Out in public, someone might smell of rosewater and bay rum, but underneath still carried a ghost of ammonia. That quiet dissonance became normal. People stopped noticing, or pretended they hadn't. The image versus reality tension ran deep. Society measured respectability through smooth white collars and ironed lace. Yet to achieve that discipline, people soaked fabrics in human waste. A woman's lace dress worn proudly in church might have passed through such a barrel only days before. The garment marked her as pure, neat, and virtuous. In truth, the fibers clung to chemical residues most worshippers tried not to consider. Respectability meant curating surfaces and ignoring origins. For poorer families, it wasn't even a choice. Soap was too costly, bluing agents used to brighten cloth were luxuries, and vinegar only went so far. Without ammonia, grease stains stayed. Dirty garments invited suspicion and judgment. Slightly off-smelling clothes that looked immaculate avoided social punishment. Better to live with a sharp scent at home than hear whispers of laziness or immorality in the street. Practical necessity outweighed personal comfort. Laundry of this kind shaped the texture of daily life. Indoor air didn't carry the breeze of fresh soap, but the tang of barrels set aside for their chemical transformation. The smell clung to alleys, backyards, and servants' quarters. Still, week after week, families repeated the process because the alternative, appearing in public in stained garments, was worse. The rhythm of collection, fermentation, soaking and rinsing became one more pattern in household survival. So when you picture those polished Victorian crowds, gentlemen in whitening shirts and women with perfect cuffs, remember the invisible step between soiling and spotless. Appearance rode on the back of a process rarely spoken about but widely accepted. Laundry may have reeked at home, but in public it created the illusion of disciplined neatness. That was the bargain. Endure the smell in private. Protect your reputation in the street. Practical chemistry sustained the illusion far more than perfumed soap ever did. If garments could be made to look spotless by strange means, what about the human face and mouth? If you were tending to your teeth in the middle of the 19th century, the first thing you'd notice is how crude the tools felt. Toothbrushes were just beginning to circulate in shops, and they weren't the soft nylon kinds we know today. Instead, they were rough little instruments, coarse animal bristles jammed into wooden handles. And what you put on those bristles had less in common with mint paste, and more with whatever could be scraped up in the kitchen or hearth. Soot rubbed from an oil lamp, table salt ground into powder, or chalk mixed with water were the most common choices. They scoured, but they also stripped away enamel. People learned quickly that every attempt to clean left just a little more damage behind. Still, pain and abrasion were often judged better than letting rot spread unchecked. This wasn't part of a daily ritual in most families. Tooth care wasn't yet bound up in the morning routine. Some people never owned a brush of their own. If a household did have one tucked away, it could be shared by everyone. A disturbing idea to us now, but cost often left no choice. For those without a brush, a rag dipped in salt water and rubbed across teeth stood in for dental hygiene. Cheap and simple, yes, but also harsh. After a few strokes, gums turned raw and sore. Yet the act, any act, was itself considered respectable, as though the proof of trying mattered more than the results. When people spoke of toothpaste, they didn't mean the neat, striped swirl you squeeze from a tube today. In mid-century Britain, paste usually meant jars or tins filled with powders and slurries of chalk, oyster shell, or even pulverized brick dust. Some mixtures included ashes scooped from the fireplace, prized for their scraping power. These powders didn't strengthen or protect teeth. They just scoured away surface stains. There was no enamel protection, no fluoride, nothing resembling preventive care. So while Victorians technically brushed, the act often did more harm than good. Teeth looked a little cleaner, but they weakened fast. The brushes themselves hardly helped. Bristles made from stiff boar hair cut into gums and frayed quickly. And since brushes cost money, people rarely replaced them. A single brush might serve a household for years, losing bristles that rotted from dampness as it went along. That meant the very tool meant to clear away bacteria often spread it more effectively. Scratched gums, loose bristles left behind, and poorly rinsed handles turned brushes into hazards. Any cut in the mouth gave infection a doorway, and in a time before antibiotics, such openings could easily prove serious. The perception of teeth also mattered. The expectation wasn't for white, straight, gleaming smiles. It was normal for teeth to yellow, wear down, and fall out well before middle age. Children grew into adolescence with recognizable decay already set in. For adults, false teeth, sometimes carved from animal bone or ivory, were common enough to be sold by merchants in growing cities. These replacements rarely fit comfortably, leaving wearers to mumble through awkward speech and meals. Bad breath was a background nuisance almost everyone accepted. Just as perfumes covered body odor, they doubled as shields against the sourness of rotting mouths, allowing households to coexist without calling it out. Home remedies reached further into odd territory. Some families used charcoal rubbed onto teeth, even if it left the gums black until rinsed away. Baking soda appeared in mixtures, sometimes balanced, sometimes not. Ground oyster shells were also used, their jagged edges polishing at first but cutting away enamel slowly. These were temporary fixes that traded immediate brightness for long-term harm. Once the enamel thinned away, rot spread quickly. And when rot advanced far, enough. There weren't many choices left. You can picture the reality. Aching teeth that throbbed day after day, swelling along the jawline. Pain that reached the ear. Families without money to pay a doctor turned to local solutions. A barber advertised extractions alongside shaves and haircuts. Imagine the scene calmly, sitting in a chair, gripping the armrests, while the barber steadies your head and works blunt pliers into your mouth. There's no anesthetic, only a stiff drink if you're lucky. The tooth gives way or snaps in two, and the aftermath is infection risk, bleeding, and weeks of soreness. For the poor, this was dental care, not prevention, not cure, simply removal. Those with a little more money sometimes turned to powders marketed by chemists. For a shilling here or there, you could buy preparations promising to whiten teeth, strengthen gums, or freshen breath. Many were simply chalk and herbs. Some, however, contained corrosive elements that harmed gums badly. Others leaned too heavily on baking soda to the point where tissue almost burned. The labels promised medical progress, while the reality was only another harsh scrub. As with perfumes masking sweat or starch-stiffening collars, appearances again mattered more than health. A polished smile, however temporary, was worthwhile if it meant looking respectable on the street. Children endured much the same neglect. Milk teeth were often ignored since parents assumed decay on them didn't matter. They would fall out anyway. The result was swelling, abscesses, and pain accepted as ordinary parts of childhood. Teens reached adulthood with ruined gums and rotting teeth already carried as a given. If a bride or groom stood at the altar with a full set of their own teeth, it was remarkable enough to be noticed. That was the standard, not brilliance, not whiteness, but survival into early adulthood with some teeth still in place. Day-to-day life carried the consequences. In a crowded railway carriage, a church pew, or a shared bedroom, foul breath smothered the air. Etiquette manuals mentioned politeness in behaviour, but rarely freshened breath as we think of it. The social world simply made peace with the smell. People covered noses discreetly with scented handkerchiefs, as though compensating for background decay the way they compensated for coal smoke or horse manure. Bad breath wasn't a stigma any more than living with soot on your windowsill. It was environmental, accepted, and endured. Even pain remedies blurred into dangerous habits. Some tooth powders incorporated opium for relief, effective but addictive in its own way. Others used caustic chemicals to burn out infected roots, leaving gums scarred and tender. Most people accepted that their teeth would not last, and that losing them early was a fact of life. Few expected to maintain a complete set, and those who did often marvelled at their luck rather than their hygiene. The lesson in all this isn't that Victorians neglected their mouths entirely, but that what they called cleaning was more performance than cure. A scrape of salt, a swirl of chalk, a shared brush. It was enough to demonstrate effort, though the results fell short. Mouths might look neat for a night, but they carried disease and decay beneath the surface. And when infection flared beyond tolerable pain, the only solution was extraction. But here was the dilemma. Private routines, however stern or unpleasant, only held back so much. The great dangers of Victorian life weren't soot or salt or boar bristles. They were the unseen forces born on the air, the illnesses spreading in ways people struggled to explain. And though Victorians scoured, masked and rinsed, the limits of such efforts became painfully clear when set against diseases no brush, no sponge, and no powder could ever ward away. Why did Victorians believe bad air could kill you? Because every foul alleyway, every sewage, soaked breeze, and every sour indoor draught carried not just discomfort but suspicion of death. They called the culprit miasma, and to them it wasn't a metaphor. Rotting smells weren't warnings. People thought the odour itself was the killer. If you caught a fever, neighbours blamed the stench wafting from the street. To breathe was to risk illness, and the way to live was to fight back against contaminated air. This belief seeped into every layer of society. Parents cautioned children not to breathe in the nasty air. Doctors leaned on the same vocabulary in their medical advice. Councils drafted policies that equated sweet smells with health and foul ones with disease. A neighbourhood tagged as stinking was a neighbourhood thought to be sickly. Respectability meant guarding what went into your lungs. The simplest measure was flinging windows wide for drafts, though city breezes often carried coal smoke or sewage odour back inside. When that happened, suspicion and anxiety only grew stronger. Household responses followed the same pattern everywhere. People tried to purify the air with what they had on hand. Vinegar sprinkled on floors or rags, herbs hung from rafters, incense burned in pots, lime scattered in corners. Families filled parlours with whichever fumes or fragrances they trusted. Hospitals lit fires or burned resins in crowded wards. City inspectors threw lime into cesspools to neutralise odours. Sometimes it was about masking the smell for comfort, sometimes a genuine conviction they were putting up a barrier between sickness and safety. In every case the nose set the rules, and yet this thinking held sway because it seemed to fit the evidence. Smelly places did line up with higher rates of disease. Families who lived near cesspools or stinking rivers did fall ill more often. The pattern looked obvious even if the mechanism was wrong. So the illusion persisted. Bad smell, bad health. The cure? Fresh air and added fragrance, leaflets, sermons, street talks, all echoed the same refrain. Purify the air, push back the stink, carry a lavender, scented handkerchief if you can afford one, or a vinegar rag if you cannot. Step into a Victorian city street through their eyes. Horse manure clogs the gutters. A thin current flows down the road from an open sewer, sour and thick. The Thames or local river produces a stench so strong it seems to cling to your clothes. Neighbours mutter about fever spreading. You raise a perfumed kerchief to your nose and, in that moment, feel shielded, less vulnerable. The conviction was powerful. People fully believed you could block death with scent alone. Class shaped the experience as it always did. Wealthier families could afford endless bowls of dried petals, sachets of lavender under pillows, even large bouquets refreshed daily in drawing rooms. Clean air meant pleasant fragrance. For poorer households, where cesspits crowded beneath the floor, vinegar cloths and scrub brushes were the only available defences. Some hung damp laundry scented with herbs across small, cramped rooms to cut through the stink. For them, the miasma fear never went away. It became part of survival, another pressure folded into daily labour. Doctors prescribed therapies rooted in the same logic. Inhale camphor, breathe menthol, let sharp oils push out bad vapours. Remedies promised cleansing through the nose. City gardens planted with lilac, lavender and roses weren't just decorative. They were billed as shields for whole neighbourhoods. Fragrance wasn't art, it was civic health policy. Hospitals drenched wards with the smoke of burning herbs. Street boards wrote notices urging residents to scatter lime or burn tar to protect themselves. And in offices and schools, people left windows cracked for constant drafts, convinced that moving air could usher death out of the building. Architecture reflected this conviction too. Builders placed large windows in communal buildings less for light than for constant ventilation. Workhouse corridors were whitewashed in lime to tamp down stink. Municipal sweepers cleared muck not only to ease walking, but because officials believed fewer smells meant fewer burials. Every improvement was still tied to odour. The boundary between cleaning and deodorizing barely existed. Ironically, the miasma obsession wasn't wholly wasteful. By pushing to eliminate foul smells, reformers pressed cities to clean streets faster, clear human waste more regularly, and demand greater ventilation indoors. They sometimes achieved better health outcomes even though they misunderstood the cause. Early sanitary reform efforts were directly powered by this logic. Miasma thinking underpinned campaigns by figures like Edwin Chadwick, who pushed for waste removal on the grounds that bad smells bred disease. In chasing away stench, they created cleaner surroundings by accident, even though the real enemies were contaminated wells and filthy pipes. But conviction in the air theory lingered too long. By treating smell as cause, reformers overlooked where the true danger pooled, in water supplies and underground infrastructure. Families kept setting out vinegar bowls and lighting incense, feeling reassured without solving the problem. And because smells really did correlate with filth, most saw no reason to doubt. The illusion held, reinforced by every sermon warning of corrupted breezes and every newspaper condemning the stench drifting off rivers at low tide. The effect reached every household. Mothers stuffed herbs under cribs to guard infants from invisible poisons. Schoolmasters burned incense when colds spread among children. Parliament itself worried about the odour of the Thames wafting through the heat of summer, fearing it could strike them down as they sat in debate. Odour marked the line between life and death. Managing it became national policy as well as private ritual. Of course, the blind spot remained. Miasma theory convinced thousands, yet the true agent lurked out of sight. Families could command their homes to smell sweeter, cities could keep streets clearer, but the illness persisted. The myth of disease in the air made people feel active while leaving deeper causes untouched. For the Victorians, that mistake would prove costly. Still, the idea that foul air was the enemy had one unfortunate blind spot, one that cholera would soon expose. It wasn't perfume or polished boots that forced Victorians to rethink what clean meant. It was cholera. The disease arrived like a sudden thunderclap. One day a person might seem well, the next they were doubled over, vomiting violently and losing water from the body so quickly that skin shrank tight against bone. Death often followed within 2 days. Outbreaks ripped through crowded cities, killing thousands without mercy to class or status. Entire blocks emptied into graveyards in a matter of weeks. All the sermons about moral cleanliness and the fuss over scented clothes proved meaningless once the epidemic touched the water people drank. And yet, Few blamed the pumps or wells. Instead, suspicion clung to what the nose could detect. The stink of the city still seemed the enemy. Waves of cholera swept across Britain during the 19th century, igniting dread wherever they struck. Families watched healthy neighbours collapse in an afternoon, and entire households vanish in a blur of grief. In cramped neighbourhoods, multiple families drew every drop of daily water from a single shared pump. It often looked clear and sparkling, and that was enough for people to trust it. Many doctors and officials still favoured the miasma theory, claiming that the bad air itself poisoned lungs. If your house stank, then your house was deadly. That seemed logical. The problem was, the most devastated communities didn't always smell the worst. Some of the clearest, sweetest tasting water carried catastrophe with it. For people trying to make sense, this contradiction reinforced their trust in the only framework they had. They argued the disease must be tied to odours, no matter how awkward the evidence. Reluctance to blame the water ran deep. Daily life depended on it. To suggest that the very stuff families drank, cooked with, and boiled for tea was killing them seemed absurd. Officials dismissed the idea partly out of fear. If true, it would prove that the lifeblood of their cities was toxic. The scale of what that implied was overwhelming. Accepting it meant rebuilding how whole districts got water, tearing into pipes, rethinking waste disposal, work that carried a cost few wanted to face. Miasma theory at least allowed an easier enemy. If bad smells spread disease, the solution was perfumes, vinegar, and street cleaning, not redesigning the spine of the city itself. This was the battlefield into which John Snow stepped. Snow was a physician who looked past popular theories. In the Soho outbreak of 1854, cholera killed more than 500 people in under 2 weeks. On Broad Street, death struck household after household surrounding one pump. Snow suspected water, not air, was to blame, so he set out to prove it with a simple, sharp method. He mapped. House by house, he marked who had died, then overlaid each death against where families fetched their water. The result was unmistakable. Deaths clustered tightly around the Broad Street pump. Breweries and institutions nearby escaped mostly unscathed, not because they had fresher air, but because they used private supplies instead of the public pump. Snow's case was visual and precise, showing that illness followed the map of a water source, not the drift of odours on the wind. His findings challenged the old certainty that stink equaled sickness. But convincing officials was another story. To admit Snow was right meant admitting that London's own water system was poisonous, that a pump in daily use was the killer. And it meant acknowledging that widespread disease would keep returning unless the city invested in expensive transformation. Adopting miasma as an explanation required only small, symbolic gestures, scattering lime on filth, ordering the streets swept, encouraging herbs and incense indoors. Accepting Snow's view meant funding engineers, ripping up neighbourhoods, building new drains and waterworks. Yet his evidence, patient and undeniable, carried weight. Snow urged the local council to act. At his insistence, the Broad Street pump handle was removed, cutting residents off from the water entirely. From that point, deaths subsided. Some viewed it as coincidence. Others saw only mystery in the sudden drop. But to Snow, and to those who studied his maps, the message was clear. What mattered was not the air above, but the liquid below. The pump had spread death, and shutting it off had slowed its grip. The Broad Street incident became a landmark, not a complete victory, but a seed planted deeply. Many doctors and officials clung to miasma for years afterward, unwilling to abandon a theory that seemed to match the evidence of smell. For others, the case offered the first firm crack in the old picture. If a disease could travel invisibly through fresh water, then cleanliness no longer belonged only to the realm of scent. It belonged underground, hidden in pipes and reservoirs. Families could sponge themselves and perfume their parlours every day, but true safety now hinged on controlling what they could not see. Snow's work didn't change minds overnight, but it placed the notion in print and maps that public health demanded clean water. His example gave reformers language to press councils and parliament for more than deodorizing gestures. Hygiene slowly began to be redefined. Cleanliness meant separation of waste from drinking water. Respectability was shifting from outward polish toward the unseen infrastructure of sanitation. This shift brought a new irony. Sermons had once preached that morality was tied to appearance, but science pushed towards something far more practical. Morality became tied to preventing death by protecting supply. Soap, perfumed collars, powders, and lace still carried social weight, but they were no longer central. Attention stretched toward drains, pipes, and pumps. And once city leaders accepted even the possibility that water spread disease, demands for action grew louder. The case for reform only sharpened as years wore on. Reports traced links between outbreaks and local water companies. Reformers like Edwin Chadwick reinforced the call by stressing the need for proper sanitation, even if still framed in miasma's language. Whether or not people admitted Snow was right, his idea lodged in the debate. From then on, any argument about cleanliness could not ignore the water supply. Yet belief alone didn't spark massive rebuilding. For Parliament and city leaders, money, politics, and disruption still made change unattractive. The acknowledgement of need was growing, but there had to be something undeniable, something that stripped away the ability to dodge responsibility. Until that happened, officials clung to short-term measures. Snow's Broad Street maps remain one of history's most enduring visuals of disease. They showed in dots and clusters what sermons and incense had failed to explain, that invisible killers didn't travel only on the air. Even so, it would take more than maps to persuade London to lift a spade. Reform trudged forward one step at a time, with reformers pressing and officials stalling. The tipping point wouldn't come from statistics or even from doctors' testimonies. It would come when those holding power faced the crisis so directly that they could no longer ignore it in their own chambers. Only then would sanitary infrastructure move from idea to construction, and it came not with another cholera outbreak, but with an overwhelming, suffocating presence that blanketed the entire city. Imagine London in the height of summer, 1858. The city air was thick and sour, carrying the unmistakable stench of human waste. The Thames, running through the heart of the capital, had turned into a vast open sewer. Each hot breeze pushed the smell into homes, shops, and offices along its banks. People pressed vinegar-soaked rags or perfumed cloths to their faces, but nothing made a difference. Rising heat only worsened things, baking filth until steam of sewage drifted straight into windows. For weeks, London wasn't just foul, it was unlivable. This wasn't sudden decay. The Thames had been a dumping ground for decades. Slaughterhouses, factories, breweries, households, all funneled waste directly into the river. Brown sludge was plain to see on most days, bobbing on the current, mixing with animal remains and industrial byproducts. The problem was tolerated until the summer heatwave made it unavoidable. What had been endured became intolerable. The smell was so overwhelming that newspapers and politicians alike gave it an official name, the Great Stink. The epicenter of the crisis was Parliament. The Houses of Commons and Lords stood directly on the Thames, curtains fluttering over the very banks of the river. Each session turned into an ordeal. Politicians tried hanging soaked cloths across windows, drenching curtains in lime chloride to disguise the stench, yet the odour barged into every chamber. Members gagged in debates, fled meetings early, and joked grimly about abandoning the building altogether. There were even serious discussions about suspending parliamentary business. The stench did what statistics, medical reports, and reformers had failed to do for decades. It stopped government itself in its tracks. When cholera and typhoid deaths filled reports, Parliament delayed. When reformers begged for sanitation projects, the plans gathered dust, marked as too costly. But when the smell invaded politicians' own breathing space, the stalemate ended. Their discomfort pointed to one man whose shelved work suddenly became urgent: Joseph Bazalgette, chief engineer of the Metropolitan Board of Works. Bazalgette had long been sketching ambitious sewer schemes, but his designs had seemed extravagant to city leaders wary of the cost. In 1858, with London gagging, those blueprints turned into rescue plans. His idea was simple in principle but staggering in scale: build massive intercepting sewers along the Thames, redirecting waste out of central London and carrying it downstream beyond the city. Instead of household waste emptying directly into the river, it would be captured, funneled into vast underground brick tunnels, and flushed out with tidal currents far from the capital. The engineering challenge was immense. Bazalgette planned over 80 miles of main intercepting sewers, supported by hundreds more miles of smaller connecting lines. These enormous brick tunnels ran parallel to the Thames, hidden beneath new embankments that also reshaped the river's edge into wide walkways. Alongside them, pumping stations were constructed, not disguised as factories, but dressed in impressive Victorian architecture, combining utility with a sense of civic pride. Bazalgette deliberately designed his sewers with much larger capacity than the city required at the time. He expected London to grow, and he built accordingly. His foresight meant that more than a century and a half later, many of his tunnels still serve the city. The Great Stink forced quick political will. Within months, funds were released, contracts signed, and crews started digging. It was a rare moment in which the city moved with urgency and unity. The disgust of Parliament and the humiliation of headlines turned gradual debate into a sprint. Newspapers and politicians, usually at odds, together demanded action. Satirical prints mocked the silent members of Parliament, meaning the Thames itself. Others described London as choking in its own filth while ruling an empire abroad. The embarrassment was too sharp to endure, so the solution, however costly, was approved. There was irony in this sudden breakthrough. Officialdom had ignored wave after wave of cholera reports. Reformers' arguments about contaminated water had been easy to downplay or reject. But this problem didn't require charts or theories to prove. It intruded on every breath, raw sensory evidence that no one could deny. The overwhelming foulness was the argument. No speech was persuasive as the air pouring into politicians' own noses. Illusion and denial broke under the heat. Construction began soon after, stretching through the 1860s. The work was enormous, the logistics complicated, and the pace unrelenting. Yet when completed, Bazalgette's network transformed the city. For the first time, London directed its waste out of living quarters instead of letting it accumulate in alleys, cesspits, and the Thames itself. Chimneys still spewed soot, horses still packed streets with manure, but one of the city's greatest dangers, human waste in its drinking water and air, finally had a channel to flow away. Bazalgette avoided flash or triumphalism. His approach was practical, calm, and deliberate. He overbuilt, not to boast, but to hedge against risk. To him, the greatest city in the world should not design its infrastructure to collapse under its own growth. The Victorian public often treated his work in awe, but what carried it forward was not glory. It was a rational acceptance that survival required engineering. Year after year, his system demonstrated its capacity, and reformers held it up as proof that scientific planning could guard against disaster more effectively than sermons or scented handkerchiefs. The Great Stink remains striking not because it was the dirtiest moment in London's history. Filth had been piling for decades, but because it was the moment sensory evidence overwhelmed excuses. You could dismiss mortality reports, resist budgets, ignore reformers. You could not work inside Parliament or walk the streets without gagging. Action became unavoidable, not from logic alone, but from lived experience of discomfort severe enough to dismantle inertia. From this turning point, London emerged with infrastructure to match its status as an imperial capital. Bazalgette's sewers carried away the danger lurking beneath illusions of respectability. A new meaning of clean began to root itself. Purity was no longer about perfume in the air or starch on collars. It had become about unseen networks beneath the pavement, about plumbing and engineering holding filth out of sight and smell. And as the 1860s gave way to the following decades, this shift rippled outward. Once waste was moved away from streets and rivers, the idea of channeling water directly inside houses suddenly seemed far more practical. From civic reform came a quieter domestic revolution. Once the city had found a way to carry waste off its streets and out of its river, the prospect of indoor bathrooms moved from dream to reality. For the first time, ordinary homes could begin to imagine running water for washing and toilets built under their own roofs. By the late 19th century, one of the clearest markers of change inside British homes was the arrival of an indoor bathroom. For Victorians, this wasn't simply a matter of luxury tiles or porcelain fittings. It represented a turning point where private life touched the growing systems of public sanitation. A household with its own bathroom was more than comfortable. It was visibly aligned with the modern city that sewers and water mains were beginning to make possible. To understand why this was so striking, it helps to remember what counted as normal before. For generations, daily routines revolved around chamber pots hidden beneath beds, backyard privies, or earth closets emptied by night soil collectors. Washing meant lugging buckets of water into basins or, if you were lucky, filling a tin tub near the kitchen hearth. Against that background, a room where water came in through pipes and waste vanished through drains felt not only futuristic but transformative. Toilets, sinks, and even fixed bathtubs changed ordinary life by reducing the endless burden of hauling, emptying, and disguising smells. Flushing mechanisms and indoor fittings had been tinkered with earlier, but in the Victorian era they shifted from oddities to genuine household features, at least in houses that could afford them. The difference was not just convenience. A bathroom made a statement about a family's place in society. It showed that you were connected to the most advanced technologies of the day, and that you could afford the installation, the upkeep, and the ongoing water charges. Guests who saw a private washroom recognized it as a symbol of status in much the same way we might glance at a new car in the driveway today. Yet very few could claim such comfort at first. In the 1870s, indoor bathrooms were confined to the wealthiest houses. Installing one required major alterations and a reliable link to city mains, both of which cost a fortune. Plumbing was labor-intensive and fragile, pipes needed regular maintenance, and builders charged heavily for the work. A tiled washroom complete with sink, flush toilet and tub was as much about display as it was about daily use. Visitors knew they were stepping into a home where modern marvels were at work, and families themselves took pride in saying they no longer relied on outdoor privies. Meanwhile, the overwhelming majority still queued at backyard brick outhouses or carried chamber pots to be emptied each morning. In many working-class districts, dozens of families used a single privy in a shared court. The pits overflowed, odours leaked into living spaces, and morning queues made any illusion of privacy vanish. On cold nights and rainy mornings, stepping outside to a reeking structure was daily misery. The contrast between an upstairs bathroom behind a polished door and a shared yard privy could not have been greater. Class was written directly into sanitation, and the lines grew sharper as some households adopted bathrooms, while others endured overflowing pits. There were attempts to improve conditions even before bathrooms became common. Mid-century laws, like the Baths and Washhouses Acts of 1846-47 and the Public Health Act of 1848, encouraged public bathing facilities and pressed municipalities to take responsibility for drainage and cleanliness. For most working families, these provisions offered some relief, a chance at a communal warm bath, or, in theory, better management of waste. Still, the slow rollout meant daily reality lagged far behind the vision of sanitation reformers. Chamber pots clung to households long after. For the sick, for young children, or simply for convenience during the night, pots under the bed stayed part of the furniture. What changed in houses with plumbing was how quickly servants or maids could empty and rinse them directly into a system of pipes rather than into cesspits. That made a difference, but only if the house was linked to the main sewer networks. Without proper connection, an indoor toilet still meant sending waste to a hidden pit beneath the floorboards, a dangerous problem waiting to erupt. The risk of disease remained if pipes ran to nowhere or if effluent seeped into the foundation. A bathroom only truly meant safety when tied into the broader infrastructure. As engineering advanced, the design of bathrooms began to anticipate what we now consider standard. Tiled floors allowed for easier scrubbing and resisted rot. Porcelain sinks and toilets gleamed with an aura of sterility, part of the rising obsession with surfaces being hygienic. Clawfoot tubs were advertised as household centerpieces, joining the ranks of parlor furniture in catalogues. Manufacturers marketed fittings with the same gusto once sold to perfumes and powders. Gleaming toilet basins and polished taps became badges of refinement. Owning them was about hygiene, yes, but equally about taste, order, and respectability. Early models came with faults. Flushing mechanisms jammed, pipes cracked under frost, and sewer gases sometimes rose into homes through poorly designed drains. Victorians feared bad smells because of miasma theory, and the idea that foul air was seeping in through one's own toilet terrified families. Builders responded with U-bend water seals and venting systems to block gases, measures that remain central features of plumbing today. At first, skeptics argued strongly against bringing privies indoors. "Why drag the stink inside?" was a common refrain, but every improvement in seals, traps, and reliable water supply slowly shifted minds. The convenience of relieving oneself indoors eventually outweighed the anxiety about smell. By the 1880s and 1890s, middle-class families began seeing bathrooms as attainable rather than unreachable. As sewers expanded and water companies extended networks, developers added bathrooms to terraced houses and smaller townhomes. Companies encouraged greater uptake since more connections meant stronger revenues. For tenants, landlords often resisted the costs until pushed by inspectors or reform campaigns. Step by step, bathrooms in modest homes shifted from aspiration to reality, though working families still relied on tin tubs by the stove for hot water. Progress was uneven, but the trend line pointed forward. These changes molded daily routines. The basin and sponge wash shrank in importance. Instead, families could fill tubs with far less effort. Bathing children no longer meant endless kettles, and women scrubbing laundry had easier access to taps. Waste disposal shifted from being a visible, foul part of life to something hidden, handled behind walls. Fewer trips across muddy yards, fewer nights spent emptying pots. The bathroom lightened the load of domestic labor. At the same time, it quietly reduced exposure to waste-related diseases, even before germ theory was fully accepted. Convenience and health advanced together, silently but steadily. Privacy changed as well. For centuries, sanitation was communal and public, from riverside washing to shared yard privies. Bringing those functions under the same roof altered perception. Going to the toilet became a private act, shielded by walls and doors. Families kept bathrooms polished, knowing a visitor who peered inside might silently judge their standards. Respectability extended to porcelain fixtures, polished taps, and neatly folded towels. To be clean now included demonstrating a home fitted with modern plumbing. Bathrooms left the realm of anonymous utility and became woven into identity. Social pressure mounted in places where bathrooms were still absent. Reformers criticized landlords who rented without indoor facilities. Inspectors called attention to overcrowded courts where families lacked access to safe drainage. The conversation shifted from personal neatness to housing standards and municipal duty. In this new context, a house with a bathroom wasn't simply fashionable, it was considered proper. What had begun as household polish turned into a civic expectation that sanitary facilities were part of decent modern housing. Bathrooms, then, represented more than indoor comfort. They were the household face of great underground sewer works, the proof that citywide projects reached private lives. They linked the polished surface of a porcelain sink with the hidden labour of engineers and bricklayers under the streets. And unlike perfume or starched collars, a bathroom could actually change the health risks experienced at home, provided the infrastructure worked. For that reason, they reshaped what people meant when they described themselves as clean. Owning a bathroom became a sign that a household had stepped into modern life. And with this new standard in place, ideas about cleanliness itself began to expand beyond basins and scents. So how did Victorians shift from perfume dabs and sponge baths to drains, sewers, and water mains? The answer lies in a deeper redefinition of cleanliness itself. For much of the century, appearance ruled. All that mattered was looking respectable: shined boots, stiff collars, crisp linen, a dab of scent. But the heavy hand of disease revealed that these gestures couldn't keep society safe. Lavender on a handkerchief didn't end epidemics. Vinegar sprays didn't block outbreaks, and no amount of starch on a shirt changed the risk of sharing a city where sewage spilled into streets and rivers. Illness forced people to see that cleanliness wasn't just a private display, it had to be built into the shared networks that carried water and waste. The realization was unsettling. For decades, families had treated hygiene as a domestic matter, controlled by discipline inside the household. But epidemics like cholera and disasters like the Great Stink made clear that no individual ritual could protect you if your water came from the same contaminated pump as everyone else's. Wiping a child's face with a sponge each morning was meaningless if the shared river brought sickness to the whole street. Hygiene could no longer be left solely to individuals. It had become a city's responsibility, woven into its infrastructure instead of its wardrobes. This shift showed up most clearly in law. The Public Health Act charged local authorities with responsibilities that households once managed alone. For the first time, drains, clean water, and the removal of what officials politely called nuisances became mandatory. These demands weren't just moral encouragement or polite advice, they carried legal weight. Inspectors had authority to intervene if cesspools overflowed, if privies leaked, or if landlords ignored repairs. Leaders and councils, not mothers with vinegar rags, were now accountable for preventing disease. Cleanliness stopped being a sign of private morality and became a matter of civic administration. The definition of nuisance stretched wider than you might expect. It covered blocked drains, piles of refuse left in alleyways, leaking cesspits, smoke-belching workshops, and animal waste. These were once just tolerated parts of city life, things people lived with so long as they held their noses. Suddenly they were matters for inspectors and boards to remove. Families might polish collars or sprinkle perfume inside, but if filth gathered outside their back doors, authorities could act. Respectability was no longer only about how neat your parlour looked, it extended to whether inspectors judged your street to be sanitary. By modern standards, this may sound obvious, but in the 19th century it was nothing short of a revolution. For the first time, government admitted it had a duty to protect public health, not merely enforce order or collect taxes, and it had practical means to do so. Inspectors could order landlords to repair broken drains. Water companies faced pressure to clean up sources long polluted. Local funds went toward clearing refuse, paving streets, and running waste carts more regularly. The shift pushed responsibility outward, away from households silently enduring filth. Now the city itself had to act. The consequences rippled through society's understanding of what it meant to be clean. Earlier in the century, visitors judged you respectable by glancing at your shirt fronts, your collar, or the shine of your boots. By the century's end, those still mattered, but new markers emerged. Was your house connected to the mains? Did your street have sewer access? Was the local pump certified? Cleanliness became a feature of infrastructure as much as of grooming. Reports and maps began to record these details. Officials measured hygiene not in spotless linens but in sanitary statistics. This cultural shift affected the tone of authority too. Sermons still exhorted neatness and order, but reformers introduced arguments about sewer systems and clean water as moral duties. They pointed fingers upward as well as downward, to landlords delaying repairs and to politicians ignoring slum conditions. Respectability extended into questions of investment. Was it righteous for wealthy districts to secure clean water while poorer areas carried buckets from polluted streams? Respectability no longer applied only to families, it applied to governments as well. The difference was that these new standards couldn't be upheld by individuals alone. You could starch your own shirt, but you couldn't dig intercepting sewers under the Thames. True cleanliness required collective engineering, shared expense, and legal oversight. For the first time, people's health rested on invisible systems carrying waste away and clean water in. This collective backbone meant you were tied to your neighbours whether you liked them or not. Their waste moved underground alongside yours and their water source fed into the same network. The private performance of neatness could not replace infrastructure. Of course, inequalities didn't vanish. Wealthy neighbourhoods secured access to mains earlier and enjoyed safer water services. Poorer districts often lagged far behind, yet the laws made it harder to ignore them entirely. Landlords faced orders to clean up or face penalty. Public water pumps were installed and monitored in working-class areas. For the first time, the principle extended beyond parlours and boulevards. Hygiene as a civic duty covered entire communities. To be clean was no longer optional, it was legally enforced. The scale of the transition is easy to overlook now. In 1800, a man could pass as respectable if his boots shone and his shirt looked pressed, despite living next door to a cesspit. By 1900, respectable homes were being measured against drains and water supplies. Upside down though it seemed, the shift worked. Epidemics slowed, survival rates climbed, and something remarkable came quietly into focus. Sanitary systems had become part of what it meant to live in a modern nation, and this payoff proved lasting. Cleanliness moved from parlours into sewers, from self-polished appearances to civic engineering. What once reassured neighbours became what protected entire populations. The result was a lasting change. Cleanliness moved from a private act of theatre to a public system that saved lives. It is here that we find the real Victorian legacy. Soap and perfume still mattered, but beneath them lay the hidden frameworks of pipes and drains. That combination, private rituals supported by civic systems, defined what clean became for future generations. It explains why, in looking back, we measure the Victorians not only by their starch and polish, but by the invisible networks that still lie beneath our streets today. And with those networks in place, the story of Victorian clean could finally close its circle, born from illusions of respectability, only to end as a reimagining of what health meant for an entire society. When you picture Victorian Britain, you might imagine a woman in an elegant dress, her hair swept up in elaborate curls and braids, pinned with pearls or combs. Or perhaps a gentleman with neatly parted hair, slick and glossy under the soft glow of a gas lamp. Hair in the Victorian world was a canvas for beauty, status, and symbolism. Yet behind the polished image, the truth of how Victorians managed their hair reveals a daily life far less glamorous and often deeply unhygienic. Unlike today, when washing hair every few days is normal, Victorians rarely allowed water and soap to touch their heads. Many people feared that washing too often, especially with cold water, could weaken the body or even invite illness. Doctors of the time warned that chilling the scalp could trigger fevers, migraines, or worse. This belief meant that a full shampoo, as we'd understand it now, might happen only a few times a year. Instead, Victorians relied on alternative methods. Brushing was considered the foundation of hair care. Women were advised to brush their hair 100 strokes each morning and night, not only to smooth it, but to spread natural oils evenly from the scalp to the tips. These oils, produced by the body, acted as the main conditioner of the time, keeping hair glossy. Of course, that same oil also trapped dust, soot, and the ever-present smoke of coal fires. In the thick air of Victorian cities, hair could feel gritty within hours of being styled. To combat grease and odour, powders became popular. Starch, ground orris root, and even crushed lavender were dusted into the hair with puffs or sprinkled by hand. Once brushed through, these powders absorbed excess oil and left behind a faint scent. It was, in a way, the ancestor of today's dry shampoo. But without modern refinements, the effect was inconsistent. Too much powder left hair looking dull and clumpy. Too little did nothing to mask the smell of sweat and smoke. For women, hairstyles themselves helped conceal the problem. Hair was worn long, often never cut except at the ends, and styled into elaborate arrangements. Once coiled, braided, and pinned, the outer layers hid the less tidy strands beneath. Decorative combs, veils, and bonnets added further cover. A woman's hairstyle could remain intact for days, even a week or more, with only brushing and minor adjustments. For men, pomades made of bear fat, lard, or petroleum jelly were massaged into the scalp to give hair its glossy finish. But the same substances that created shine also trapped dirt and encouraged a greasy buildup. And then there was the ever-present problem of lice. Victorian households, no matter how wealthy, battled lice constantly. The creatures thrived in unwashed hair, in wigs still fashionable among older men, and in the thick fabrics of upholstered furniture. Remedies ranged from combing with fine metal teeth to rubbing vinegar, kerosene, or even mercury compounds into the scalp. These treatments could be as harmful as the parasites themselves. Yet lice infestations were so common that they carried little stigma. They were an unpleasant fact of life. Hair was not just a matter of hygiene, it was also a symbol of morality, sexuality, and identity. For women, long, well-kept hair was a marker of virtue. To cut it short was considered shocking, almost indecent, unless done for reasons of illness. Locks of hair were exchanged between lovers, woven into jewellery, or saved as mourning tokens. The very presence of abundant hair was seen as a reflection of vitality and purity, even if that hair was far from clean. For men, the fashion of the time leaned toward a tidy part, a moustache, or in some decades, a full beard. Facial hair became linked to masculinity and moral seriousness. Pamphlets circulated about how a beard could protect a man from the soot of the city, acting like a natural filter. In reality, it trapped food, smoke, and dust, and without regular washing, could develop its own odour. Yet beards remained a proud statement of virility and faith in natural design. Victorian hair care also intersected with industry and commerce. The demand for hair products led to a boom in oils, pomades, combs, and brushes. Some products were harmless: lavender water, almond oil, rose pomade. Others were downright dangerous. Lead acetate was added to darken greying hair despite its toxicity. Sulfur and tar appeared in treatments for dandruff. Advertisements promised miraculous growth and shine, but often delivered irritation and long-term damage. Hairdressers became important figures in society, particularly for wealthy women. These professionals created the elaborate updos required for balls, dinners, and social calls. Yet even their artistry could not disguise the underlying reality. That hair carried the daily grime of coal smoke, candle soot, and sweat. Perfumed oils, powders, and floral decorations became essential in masking what could not be washed away. The lower classes, lacking money for such luxuries, often tied their hair back simply, covered it with caps or cropped it short to make lice easier to manage. Washerwomen and servants were sometimes identifiable by their rough, brittle hair, a sign of hard labour, poor diet, and lack of care. In contrast, the shining ringlets of the upper class broadcast wealth, not because the hair was cleaner, but because it had been styled and perfumed into acceptability. Interestingly, Victorians also saw hair as a record of the body. Just as nails and skin reflected health, hair was thought to reveal the balance of a person's constitution. Doctors claimed that brittle or thinning hair suggested nervous disorders or poor digestion. Hair lost in illness was collected and studied, sometimes kept in diaries. In this way, the state of the hair became both a personal concern and a topic of medical speculation. By the late 19th century, public health reforms began to influence hair care too. As indoor plumbing improved and bathrooms became more common, the idea of washing hair with water slowly gained ground. Soap manufacturers introduced products marketed specifically for the scalp, though these were harsh and often stripped hair of natural oils. Still, the gradual shift toward cleanliness reflected a wider cultural change. That hygiene, once managed with perfume and powders, should involve actual washing. Looking back, Victorian hair care reveals a world caught between appearances and reality. Outwardly, hair shimmered with oil, powder and perfume, arranged in graceful styles. But beneath the surface lay grease, dust, lice and chemical residues. The elaborate image of refinement was maintained through daily effort, but the standard of clean was worlds away from what we would expect today. And yet, in its own way, Victorian hair told a story. It spoke of the city's smoke and dirt, of the medical fears that kept water away from scalps, of the social values that equated hair with morality and status. Each strand was both a physical presence and a cultural symbol. To run a comb through it was to brush not only against dust and oil but against the tangled beliefs of an era. So, the next time you imagine a Victorian lady adjusting her curls or a gentleman smoothing down his moustache, remember, behind the polished surface was a world of hidden compromises, powders and oils, and an endless battle with the realities of living in a coal-fueled, soot-filled city. Hair was pride, identity and ornament, but it was rarely, by our standards, clean. When we talk about hygiene, most of us imagine daily showers, fresh clothes and soap lathering up in warm water. But in Victorian Britain, the idea of being clean had less to do with washing the body and far more to do with what lay directly against the skin: underwear. To understand Victorian hygiene, you need to understand the role of linen and the belief that clothing, rather than bathing, could absorb and remove dirt from the body. For most Victorians, bathing was a rare and sometimes seasonal practice. Water was heavy to draw, difficult to heat, and expensive to supply, especially in the crowded cities. A full bath in a tin tub meant hauling gallons of water from the pump, warming it over a fire, and then discarding it again afterward. Few homes had private bathrooms before the late 19th century. So instead of daily washing, people relied on changing their underclothes, the garments worn closest to the skin, as the primary way of staying clean. Linen was believed to have almost magical properties. It was absorbent, drawing sweat, oil and dirt away from the skin. By removing and laundering the linen, Victorians thought they were removing impurities from their bodies as well. A lady could go days, even weeks, without bathing, yet still be considered fresh if her chemise and drawers were regularly changed. Similarly, men wore long undershirts and drawers that were supposed to soak up the grime of the day. How often did they change these undergarments? It varied, depending on class and means. Wealthier Victorians could afford multiple sets of linen and had servants to launder them frequently. Some women's manuals recommended changing underclothes 2 or 3 times a week, though not necessarily daily. For the working poor, however, owning even 2 sets of linen was a luxury. A single chemise might be worn until it was visibly soiled, stiff with sweat, and then hurriedly washed in cold water on the weekend. Laundry itself was an ordeal. Soap was harsh, water was heavy, and scrubbing linen on washboards left hands raw. The famous Monday wash day consumed entire households, with servants or mothers boiling, wringing and hanging linens to dry. The difficulty of the task meant that undergarments were the priority. Outer garments like dresses, coats or trousers were rarely washed at all. They were brushed, shaken out and aired by the fire. But true laundering was infrequent. This created a paradox. The part of the outfit closest to the skin was the cleanest, while the outer layers, those on public display, might carry weeks of dirt, dust and odour. For women, underwear was also part of a complex system of modesty and morality. A respectable woman might wear a chemise, drawers, a corset, petticoats, and stockings beneath her gown. Each layer was meant not only to shape her figure but to guard her skin from contact with the outside world. Cleanliness was therefore equated with protection. The more layers between the body and the public, the more pure the woman was seen to be. Whether or not she ever washed her actual body mattered far less. Men's undergarments were simpler, but served the same purpose. A long undershirt and drawers kept sweat away from suits, which were expensive to clean. Collars and cuffs, detachable and starched, became the most visible markers of male hygiene. A man with a crisp white collar was assumed to be clean, disciplined, and respectable, even if his undershirt beneath was stiff with days of perspiration. Perfume again played a role here. Scented sachets were sometimes pinned inside clothing to mask odours, and laundry was often finished with lavender or rose water. Even so, the smell of unwashed bodies was a constant feature of Victorian life. Public gatherings, theatres, churches, trains were thick with human scent. Yet this was not necessarily considered offensive, so long as one's clothes appeared well kept and linen looked white. The wealthy often sent their laundry to professional laundresses, while the poor did their best with communal pumps or rivers. In cities, the sight of garments hanging on lines between crowded buildings was part of daily life. In the countryside, washing days turned streams into social gathering places where gossip was exchanged alongside scrubbing. Laundry, more than bathing, was the true rhythm of cleanliness in the Victorian world. Of course, this system had its flaws. Changing linen might remove surface sweat, but it did little against lice, fleas, and skin diseases. Medical journals of the time frequently noted rashes, sores, and infestations among even the well-dressed. Doctors gradually began to argue that bathing the skin itself was essential, but these ideas spread slowly. Resistance came not only from practical concerns but from moral ones. Some Victorians feared that too much bathing, especially in warm water, encouraged sensuality and weakened moral fibre. Still, by the late 19th century, the tide was turning. Soap manufacturing became cheaper and more widespread, and public bathhouses were built in many cities. These institutions offered working-class families the chance to wash more thoroughly, sometimes for the first time in their lives. At the same time, the upper classes began to embrace daily washing as a mark of refinement, aided by the arrival of indoor plumbing and heated water systems. Yet for much of the era, underwear remained the key marker of hygiene. It was underwear, not soap or water, that Victorians trusted to keep them clean. A well-laundered chemise could make up for a month without bathing. A spotless collar could convince others of a man's discipline, even if his body beneath was neglected. Cleanliness, in Victorian eyes, was as much about fabric as about flesh. This reliance on linen also shaped cultural values. White linen symbolised purity, both physical and moral. The brightness of laundry was often exaggerated in advertisements for soap and starch, suggesting that true cleanliness was visible to the eye. A woman who managed her washing well was praised for her virtue as a housekeeper and moral guardian. A man whose collar gleamed could expect better treatment in business and society. The politics of laundry were the politics of respectability. Looking back, it's striking how different Victorian standards were from ours. Today, we equate hygiene with the body itself: showers, deodorant, clean skin. For Victorians, it was the fabric against the skin that carried the burden of cleanliness. Clothes absorbed what the body shed, and washing those clothes, no matter how infrequent, was thought to purify the person too. So the next time you picture a Victorian woman adjusting her corset, or a gentleman straightening his collar, imagine what lay beneath: layers of linen, carefully laundered, serving as a substitute for soap and water. It was a system that kept appearances intact, even if the body beneath remained largely untouched by the cleansing hand of a bath. In the Victorian imagination, the mouth was not just a place for eating or speaking, it was a measure of personal discipline, health, and even morality. A radiant smile, or at least one free from visible decay, suggested refinement, while rotting teeth could mark you as careless, poor, or even corrupt in character. But dental hygiene in Victorian Britain was far from what we know today. In fact, the ways people cared for their teeth reveal both the limitations of the time and the creativity born of necessity. For most Victorians, toothpaste as we know it simply did not exist. Instead, people used tooth powders, often sold in small tins or jars. These powders could be made from chalk, crushed cuttlefish bone, burnt bread, or even powdered brick. Some recipes added soap flakes or salt for extra cleansing power. Flavourings were scarce, though a touch of peppermint oil or clove could sometimes be found. Imagine rubbing gritty chalk and soot across your teeth each morning. It was abrasive, effective at scrubbing, but often damaging to the enamel. Homemade tooth powders were common among the poor. A simple mixture of salt and bicarbonate of soda might be rubbed onto the teeth with a rag wrapped around the finger. Others used a sprig of wood or a feather to scrape between the teeth. More eccentric remedies included rubbing the teeth with crushed tobacco or even honey mixed with ground charcoal. These methods varied in effectiveness, but all shared the goal of making the mouth appear and smell cleaner, even if they caused long-term harm. Toothbrushes were available, but not universal. Many were imported from China or made domestically with bone handles and bristles from pigs or horses. They were expensive, and for working families, a rag or stick was cheaper and more practical. Among the middle and upper classes, however, the toothbrush was a marker of refinement, a small ritual of daily discipline that separated the genteel from the rough. By the 1840s and 1850s, advertisements began to stress the importance of regular brushing, often appealing to women by linking clean teeth to attractiveness and marriage prospects. Mouthwash, too, had its place. But it was nothing like the blue or green liquid we know today. Victorian mouth rinses were made of vinegar, alum, or spirits such as brandy mixed with herbs. Some formulas promised to kill odour, while others claimed to strengthen the gums. One popular recipe combined myrrh, cinnamon, and red wine, producing a potent aromatic wash. Whether these concoctions did much more than sting is doubtful, but they at least left the impression of freshness in a time when halitosis was a common complaint. Dental pain was a near universal experience. Toothache was one of the most dreaded afflictions of the Victorian poor, and remedies were often desperate. Clove oil, laudanum, or even opium were applied to aching gums. Some believed holding a hot brick to the cheek could draw out the pain. Others recited charms or carried talismans, hoping for relief. But when pain became unbearable, there was only one true solution: extraction. Dentistry in the early 19th century was a brutal affair. Professional dentists existed, but they were few and their services were costly. More often, extractions were performed by barbers, blacksmiths, or travelling tooth drawers who offered their services at markets and fairs. Imagine a man sitting on a stool in a crowded square gripping a patient's jaw with iron forceps while a curious crowd looked on. Speed was essential, there was no anaesthetic, and the scream of the patient was part of the spectacle. By mid-century, dentistry was becoming more professionalised. The introduction of ether and chloroform in the 1840s offered, at least for the wealthy, a chance to have teeth pulled without agony. The establishment of dental schools in London in the 1850s and 1860s began to transform the practice into a recognised medical field. Yet for most of the working poor, dental care remained crude and painful well into the century. Artificial teeth also played a surprising role in Victorian hygiene. False teeth were in demand, not only for chewing, but for appearance. Materials ranged from porcelain to ivory, and in some cases, human teeth. The latter often came from corpses. Battlefield dead supplied what were grimly called Waterloo teeth. Others were taken from the mouths of the poor and sold to dentists. To own a gleaming set of false teeth was a status symbol, signalling both wealth and the desire to project refinement. The obsession with appearances extended beyond individual vanity. Clean white teeth became associated with moral purity and even national strength. Writers warned that decay and neglect were signs of a declining race. Advertisements for powders and brushes promised not only beauty but respectability and success. To care for one's mouth was to care for one's future. At the same time, Victorian diets made dental health more precarious. Sugar consumption increased dramatically during the 19th century, as imports from Caribbean plantations and later beet sugar factories made it widely affordable. Sticky sweets, jams, and sweetened tea became staples, even for the poor. This sugar surge accelerated decay, making toothache even more common. Dentists of the time frequently remarked on the epidemic of bad teeth among the working classes. For the wealthy, frequent visits to the dentist became fashionable. Some women had their teeth cosmetically filed or polished, while men sought dentures to restore their smiles. Advertisements promised miracle powders that could restore pearly whiteness or banish decay forever. Of course, many of these claims were exaggerated, but the growing industry reflected a cultural shift. Clean, white teeth were becoming as important to appearance as clean clothes or perfumed skin. What is striking is how dental hygiene reveals the Victorian gap between appearance and reality. A gentleman might never bathe, yet his gleaming collar and polished teeth marked him as respectable. A lady might endure rotten molars, but so long as her smile appeared intact in public, she preserved her image of refinement. Hygiene was, above all, about how others perceived you. By the end of the Victorian era, advances in dentistry, safer anaesthetics, better tools, and more scientific understanding of decay were setting the stage for modern practices. Yet the legacy of the 19th century remains, the link between dental health, beauty, and social respectability that still influences us today. When we speak of a winning smile, we echo a Victorian belief that teeth were not just functional, but deeply symbolic of character. So, the next time you brush your teeth, imagine the grit of chalk powder or the sting of vinegar mouthwash. Picture the crowded marketplace where a tooth was pulled before a jeering crowd, or the delicate porcelain dentures fitted into the mouth of a society lady. For Victorians, every smile carried with it the burden of pain, discipline, and social expectation. Hygiene was never just about health, it was about who you were and how the world judged you. Victorian clean began as a mask. A polished shoe, a dab of cologne, a quick sponge at the basin. These gestures kept up appearances, but they offered little real protection. True health only arrived when pipes and drains redefined daily life, when whole cities embraced infrastructure instead of illusion. Respectability once meant perfume on the wrist. Today, it's the simple motion of turning a tap and drinking safe water without hesitation. If you enjoyed this quiet look at how we got here, consider subscribing for more gentle history like this. Rest easy, our taps remain a hard, one comfort.